This included the carpets, it also included the sound system, and these are suggestions that were made by the Fajr group. So I want to thank all of you for your suggestions. We take them very seriously here at Adam Center. And this is a membership organization, meaning the members control the organization. They give advice, and it's the responsibility of the Board of Trustees and the leadership to listen to your comments and suggestions. So thanks so much for the suggestions for the carpets. We try to implement that based on your advice, and we'll inshallah continue to listen to the membership. So inshallah today we are at Surah Al-Mudaththir, verse number 18. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse, in the surah is Surah Al-Mudaththir, which is in the larger chapter of Tabarak, Juz al-Tabarak. And as we know in this Juz, is the Juz of the Meccan era. In a time where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was doing the da'wah, he was doing the preaching, and he encountered stubbornness. And we see this in Surah Nuh, where Nuh alayhi salam is going and he's constantly going to his people and asking them to accept what they reject. So why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this era reveal the story of Nuh? So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would receive solace, and you understand that his struggle was similar to the struggles of other prophets. Now we see in Surah Al-Mudaththir that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to rise, kum fa'andir, continue to do the da'wah. But when he's doing the da'wah, he encounters people who are rejecting him, even though they know that he is correct, even though they know that the Quran is wahi. And we see this in verse 16. It says, كَلَّا إِنَّهُ كَانَ لِآيَاتِنَا عَنِيدًا. Verily there are people in the Meccan era that are anid, which means that they're stubborn and they do not want to listen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes here one of these stubborn people, which the Mufassirin, they identify as Walid ibn Mughira. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّهُ فَكَّرَ وَقَدَّرَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this one stubborn person who was one of the chiefs of Mecca. And he was one that had a lot of wealth and power, and he heard the Quran. And in the Tafseer, they talk about how he reacted when he heard the Quran. So we see, for example, that Ibn Kathir, he says, وَخَرَجَ عِنْدَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. So Walid ibn Mughira was with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he left from there. And then he told the other Quraysh, سَمِعْتُ عَنْ مُحَمَّدٍ كَلَامًا لَيْسَ مِنْ كَلَامٍ إِنْسٍ. He said, I heard from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam some words that are not the words of humans. And he was a smart, educated man. He knew poetry. وَلَا مِنْ كَلَامٍ الْجِنِّ. And he said, this is not the words of jinn. This is not sorcery. This is something unique. This is wahi. وَإِنَّ لَهُ لَحَلَاوَةً. This is something that's beautiful. It tastes great. It's wonderful. It's unique. وَإِنَّ عَلَيْهِ لَطَلَاوَةً. And that verily is something that's beautiful and nice. وَأَنَّهُ يَعْلُو. And it raises. وَلَا يُعْلَى عَلَيْهِ. SubhanAllah. And nothing is risen over it. Another riwayah says that he was with a companion named Ali Abi Bakr ibn Abi Quhafa. And when he was with this companion, he heard the Quran, particularly Surah Al-Sajdah. And then he left that companion, and the riwayah says, خَرَجَ عَلَى قُرَيْشٍ فَقَالَ يَا عَجَبًا. So he went to the Quraysh people and he said, oh my Quraysh, this is something that's ajib, this is unique, beautiful. لِمَا يَقُولُ Ibn Abi Kabsha. So this is the person, the companion that he went to, and he was reciting the Quran. فَوَاللَّهِ مَا هُوَ بِشِعْرٍ. He said, by Allah, I swear by Allah, this is not poetry. وَلَا بِسِحْرٍ. And this is not sorcery. وَبِهَذَيْ مِنَ الْجُنُونِ. And this is not something of a madman, someone who was crazy. وَإِنَّ قَوْلَهُ لِمِنْ كَلَامِ اللَّهِ. SubhanAllah. This is verily the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Walid ibn Mughira heard the Quran, he was smart, he was intelligent, and he went to the Quraysh people and he exclaimed how beautiful the Quran was. Now the Quraysh became scared. They said, if Walid ibn Mughira becomes Muslim and leaves our religion, then we're lost. Everything is forsaken. So Abu Jahl, in one of the riwayah, he tasked himself, and he said, I'm going to go and talk to Walid ibn Mughira. And then he went to Walid ibn Mughira, and he said to him, we as the Quraysh were gathering a lot of money to give to you. And he said, why? He said, you went to this companion's house, and we heard that you went there to get some food because you didn't have anything. So Walid became upset because he was rich and he had wealth. And then said, now the people are looking down at me that I'm going to this companion's house and seeking support and aid. No. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes what he did next. إِنَّهُ فَكَّرَ وَقَدَّرَ Subhanallah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here talks and says that he started to think, Walid ibn Mughira. And then وَقَدَّرَ. And qaddar means he started to measure. And you can see this. When they're contemplating something, you can see that they're thinking. You can see that they're analyzing. What's my next step? What decision am I going to make? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقُتِلَ كَيْفَ قَدَّرَ Subhanallah. And then, cursed be on how he decided next. Because all of us first think, right? We're contemplating. But then we make a decision. ثُمَّ قُتِلَ كَيْفَ قَدَّرَ And then verily, be cursed on how he decides. So it's mentioned twice. And the Mufassirin here say, this is a ta'keed. ثُمَّ قُتِلَ كَيْفَ قَدَّرَ Again, this is a curse on how he began to contemplate. ثُمَّ نَظَرَ So then he started to think to himself, right? And ask, what should I do? ثُمَّ عَبَسَ وَبَسَرَ Subhanallah. And then he frowned and he scowled. And this is so beautiful in the Quran. One of the things I love about reading the Quran is how it describes human emotion and action. So first you can see the thinking, right? Then you can see he's measuring, right? If I become Muslim, what's going to happen to my wealth? What's going to happen to my prestige? What's going to happen to my children? Right? He's balancing. And then it appears upon his face. And you see so many verses in the Quran talk about the face and how it responds. Abasa wa tawalla, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam at one point frowned. And here the Mufassirin talk about abas as frowning with the mouth, but mostly with the eyebrows. When someone puts their eyebrows down like this is abas. And then basar is similar to abas, but it's different in that the Mufassirin talk about the face becoming red and upset and scowling. ثُمَّ أَدْبَرَ وَاسْتَكْبَرَ Subhanallah. Then he turned his back away from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and the Quran. Why? وَاسْتَكْبَرَ Subhanallah. Because he became arrogant. Because he knew that if he accepted Islam and he knew if he accepted the Quran, there would be consequences for him and his social status. And then what did he say? فَقَالَ إِنَّ هَذَا إِلَّا سِحْرٌ يُؤْثَرُ Subhanallah. This is now simply sorcery. And we saw this earlier in his riwayah. He said, this isn't sorcery. وَلَا بِسِحْرٍ But now he's coming up with a new idea. إِنْ هَذَا إِلَّا قَوْلُ الْبَشَرِ Subhanallah. This is only the word of a human. And you saw in the riwayah, he said, هَذَا مِنْ كَلَامِ اللَّهِ This is from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأُصْلِيهِ سَقَرَ That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put him in the hellfire. And here, what's remarkable, also unique about these verses is the ra. Every surah is unique. And you see in the Mudaththir, the ra rhyme scheme. Ya ayyuhal mudaththir, qum fa'anzir. And you can see this in the verses here. ثُمَّ نَذَرَ ثُمَّ عَبَسَ وَبَسَرَ ثُمَّ أَدْبَرَ وَاسْتَكْبَرَ Right, the constant using of the rhyme and how it beautifully kind of moves you through the surah. So brothers and sisters in Islam, to conclude, we see that these verses in the Quran talk about the preaching of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the surah and says, Ya ayyuhal mudaththir, the one who is covered, the one who is praying, Qum fa'anzir, rise and warn people. But in the process of his preaching, he found the stubbornness. People knew that he was right. People knew that he was saying something correct. They knew that his words were not sorcery or words of a madman or poetry. They understood that it was kalam Allah. But why didn't they accept it? Because there were consequences. There were social consequences for doing so. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses gives the example of Walid ibn Mughira. And it's important for us to reflect, especially on the eve of Ramadan. It's not one day and tomorrow. And I would like to wish all of you Ramadan Mubarak early, and that inshallah we are able to pray Taraweeh tonight here at Adams, is that we reflect on the story of Surah Al-Mudaththir, and we reflect on the story of Walid ibn Mughira. Because all of us in our lives will find ourselves in that situation. All of us in our lives will be faced with certain decisions we have to make, and we will think about them. فَكَّرَ وَقَدَّرَ. And we will measure. And in the decision, we'll weigh the pros and cons. We'll weigh the consequences. And then we'll finally say something and do something. And when we're in that process of tafkir and taqdeer, it's important to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's important to remember the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it's important to remember the truth, the haqq, is the most important thing. And there will be times for each and every single one of us that we will be put in situations where we have to do what is just. And if we look at the different consequences, we realize, yes, it will be difficult, yes, it will be challenging. But the best thing is to follow the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to conclude, I'll ask all of us to reflect on these verses and to think about a time where we were in a similar situation, and in future times when we are in that moment of tafkir, of thinking, contemplating, measuring. And I pray that all of us will make the right decision that represents truth and justice. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.